Seattle was draped in a slick layer of mist that night, with lights shimmering off the streets like stars scattered across a dark sky. Lena and I arrived at the bar, a high-end spot perched on the rooftop of one of the newer hotels downtown. The occasion was Alex's promotion. His hard work had finally paid off, and tonight was supposed to be about celebrating him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the real event happening here had nothing to do with Alex's new position. It was something else, something I hadn't yet put my finger on but felt looming just out of sight. Lena looked stunning, as always, in a deep green dress that flowed around her in elegant waves. She'd spent extra time getting ready, and I'd watched her closely as she'd applied her makeup with the steady hand of someone painting her armor. I'd assumed she'd wanted to look her best for me, her husband, but now, here in the dimly lit bar, I was starting to wonder. Every few moments, I'd catch her glancing across the room, her gaze fixated on a man I knew all too well by reputation. Ray, the tech executive who had made himself famous not only for his rapid rise in Silicon Valley, but also for the trail of broken marriages left in his wake. I tried to focus on the conversation at our table, but it was impossible. Lena's gaze was anchored to Ray with a fascination she'd never bothered to mask. My stomach twisted each time she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes or leaned in just slightly closer than necessary. Even Alex, who was usually oblivious to undercurrents, gave me a strange look when Lena's hand lingered on Ray's arm during a story she'd heard 100 times from me, yet found inexplicably hilarious when Ray told it. "Lena seems extra friendly tonight." "Huh?" Alex remarked, trying to sound casual as he downed the rest of his drink. I could tell he was attempting to smooth over the tension he'd picked up on. "Maybe it's just the atmosphere," I replied, my voice strained. "Big night, good drinks." Alex looked at me, brow furrowed, and then quickly looked away. Something in his expression was off. It was as if he knew something more than he was letting on, but couldn't decide whether it was his place to say anything. His silence was damning. I felt a pulse of heat rise in my chest as I watched Lena glance over her shoulder. Her expression brightened when Ray caught her gaze, and in that instant, it was as though I ceased to exist. She murmured something under her breath, smiling like a teenager with her first crush, then excused herself from the table without even looking in my direction. I watched her walk toward him, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. When she slipped her hand into his and he didn't pull away, my vision blurred. "Alex, do you see this?" I asked, leaning in, barely managing to keep my voice steady. "See what?" he asked, pretending to scan the room, but his eyes didn't reach Lena and Ray. He fiddled with his empty glass, avoiding eye contact. "She's with Ray," I said flatly. "Did you know about this?" Alex hesitated, then shook his head a little too quickly. "No, of course not. Lena she just looks like she's having fun. We're all celebrating, right?" But his voice wavered, betraying him. I saw it clearly now, the faint tremor in his tone, the way he couldn't meet my eyes. He'd known, at least in part, and had decided not to tell me. Whether out of loyalty to Lena or fear of ruining our friendship, I didn't know, but his silence cut me almost as deeply as the sight of Lena walking hand in hand with Ray toward the bar. Unable to watch any longer, I forced myself to look away, but each sound, a laugh, a murmur, brought me back to that corner where Lena and Ray stood. I watched them again, steeling myself against the painful disbelief as he whispered something in her ear. She laughed in response, the kind of laugh I used to hear at home. It felt like a twisted mockery, as though she were mocking the life we'd built together, the trust I'd placed in her. Finally, I saw them slip through the side door leading to the private balconies, disappearing into the darkness beyond. My fingers curled into fists, and I felt the cold bite of my nails pressing into my palms. I felt Alex's hand on my shoulder, though he quickly pulled back when he sensed the tension rippling through me. "Daniel," he began, his tone gentle, apologetic even. But I didn't want his pity, and I certainly didn't want his excuses. "Not now," I muttered, standing up. "I just need some air." Without waiting for his response, I left the table, heading for the exit. Outside, the cool Seattle night hit me like a splash of water, clearing the haze of anger that clouded my vision. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Losing control wasn't an option. Not yet. When I returned to the table an hour later, Lena was back, acting as if nothing had happened, laughing and sipping her drink as though this night had been nothing more than a fun outing. She looked at me with that same, familiar gaze, one I had once thought sincere. But now, all I saw was deceit. The next morning, I decided not to confront her right away. Instead, I poured a cup of coffee and went through her messages. A breach of trust, yes, but one that felt justified given what I'd seen the night before. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her recent messages, looking for anything that could confirm my suspicions. I found it all too quickly. A message from Ray, filled with thinly veiled innuendos and the line that left no room for doubt. Last night was unforgettable. The words stabbed at me, but I felt a strange calmness settle over me. Confronting her immediately would be letting her see my pain, letting her know how deeply she'd wounded me. Instead, I resolved to take a different approach, one that would leave her wondering, guessing. I would reclaim control, piece by piece, and if she thought she could turn to her friends for support, she would be mistaken. The evening air was dense with the sounds of Seattle nightlife. Car horns, music spilling from bars, and the chatter of people slipping from one crowded venue to the next. I found myself standing outside a club on Fifth Avenue, the kind of place I hadn't set foot in since my early 20s. The neon sign buzzed above, casting a garish glow over the line at the door. This was not the life I'd imagined for myself. But tonight, anything that took me away from the house I'd shared with Lena felt like a sanctuary. I stepped inside, and the music hit me like a physical force. It was a lively, energetic beat, the kind that made people forget about tomorrow. I ordered a drink, scanning the room as though I might recognize someone, though I prayed I wouldn't. My eyes landed on a small group near the dance floor. Among them was a woman with dark, wavy hair that flowed around her shoulders, moving to the beat with an easy grace that drew my attention immediately. As I watched, she turned, caught my eye, and smiled. I looked away, feeling like an outsider in my own skin. But before I could disappear back into the shadows, she was there, sliding onto the bar stool next to me. "Not your scene?" she asked, her eyes studying me with a curiosity that felt oddly reassuring. "No, not really," I admitted, realizing how stiff my voice sounded. I cleared my throat and attempted to soften my tone. "But I guess everyone needs a change once in a while." She tilted her head, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Well, that sounds like the opening line of a man with a story to tell. Care to share?" I laughed a bit too bitterly, but the warmth of her presence was already working some kind of magic. "Maybe some other time. Tonight, I think I'd rather just forget about everything." "Then let's dance," she said, standing and holding out her hand as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Come on, trust me, it'll help." Against my better judgment, I took her hand and let her lead me to the floor. The music pounded around us, and as we moved, I felt something loosening within me, something long buried beneath layers of routine, obligations, and broken promises. She introduced herself as Rachel, and as we danced, I learned she was a dance instructor who taught classes in the evenings at a studio downtown. Her laugh was easy, and her questions simple, unburdened by hidden motives or history. When the song ended, Rachel pulled me toward her friends, a small group of people who welcomed me without questions or judgment. They were quick with jokes, had easy laughs, and most importantly, knew nothing about the life I was trying to leave behind. As the night wore on, I found myself talking freely, recounting bits of my life and ambitions that had gathered dust in the corners of my mind. I felt like a stranger to myself, and yet I couldn't deny this strange exhilaration. "Here's to new beginnings," Rachel said at one point, lifting her glass. The group clinked their glasses together, and for a brief moment, the weight of Lena's betrayal felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. Hours later, I walked back to my car alone, but somehow lighter. The club's energy still buzzed through me as I drove back home, my mind racing with ideas, a newfound determination brewing. By the time I arrived, I decided I would remake my life. Not for her, not for anyone else, but for me. The next day, I started the renovations. It wasn't enough to just distance myself from Lena emotionally. I needed physical separation too, a clear division. I cleared out the cluttered storage room, turning it into an office that would eventually be my private retreat. Walls that once held our photos were stripped bare. The space began to change under my hands, each swing of the hammer an act of defiance, a testament to my new independence. A few days into the work, Alex stopped by. He took in the bare walls, the paint cans scattered around, and the sight of me on a ladder, hanging new light fixtures. "What's going on here?" he asked, attempting a casual laugh, though his eyes were dark with worry. I climbed down, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Change," I said simply. "Something we could all use." He glanced around the room, his gaze falling on my wedding ring resting on the kitchen counter. The sight of it seemed to unsettle him, but he kept his tone light. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" I picked up the ring, turning it over in my hand before extending it to him. "Here," I said, a steady calm in my voice. "Next time you see Lena, give it to her." Alex's face went through a range of emotions: shock, discomfort, and finally, a reluctant understanding. He took the ring, holding it like it might burn him, then met my eyes. "You're really done then?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "More done than you know," I replied. Alex hesitated, looking down at the ring. "You know, I saw her with Ray that night." I didn't say anything because, I don't know, I thought it wasn't my place. For a moment, the weight of his silence hit me as hard as Lena's betrayal. I wanted to shout, to tell him how much his silence had cost me. But instead, I just nodded. "You did what you thought was best," I said, hearing the emptiness in my own words. He looked at me, guilt etched across his face, then nodded, clutching the ring tightly. As he left, I saw a strange look in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, as if he were questioning his own choices, his own trust. It was a small victory, but in that moment, I realized I didn't need revenge. The truth would find its way out on its own, spreading like cracks in a fractured mirror. By the time I finished for the day, the house felt transformed. The walls, the furniture, the decor. It was all mine now, untouched by Lena's influence. As I sank into the chair in my new office, the silence felt heavy, yes, but it was also clean, untainted. That evening, I called Rachel. Her voice on the other end was a balm, steady and warm, and she agreed to meet up for coffee later in the week. The scent of expensive cologne and polished leather filled the air as I stepped into Lena's office for the first time in months. It was a rare occasion that brought me there, signing papers for the renovations that would legally separate parts of our property. I had agreed to meet her here, hoping to keep things brief and businesslike. Her office was the kind of place designed to impress. Modern furniture, large glass windows overlooking the city, and sleek decor that screamed of success. But even here, I felt an uneasy undertone, as if the space held secrets it was waiting to reveal. Lena walked over to greet me, her face painted in a bright, practiced smile. "Daniel, I appreciate you coming by. I know this hasn't been easy for either of us." Her tone was so casual it almost made me laugh. "Easy?" I thought, biting back the urge to tell her exactly what I thought of her appreciation. Instead, I just nodded, deciding to keep the conversation focused. "Let's get through this quickly, Lena," I replied, glancing down at the papers in my hand. But as I looked up, I noticed her glance beyond me toward the corridor, where Ray was leaning casually against the doorframe, chatting with one of Lena's married colleagues. His easy, practiced smile and relaxed posture were almost theatrical, as though he were trying to catch Lena's eye. She seemed to watch him as if she'd been expecting him. As I signed the last page, I noticed her gaze hadn't wavered. "Busy day?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She blinked, clearly startled, and looked back at me. "Yes, it's always like this," she replied quickly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. But the way her gaze flickered back to Ray revealed more than she intended. I could see the look of something close to jealousy flash across her face as Ray continued his animated conversation with the other woman. Curiosity got the best of me. I stayed silent, merely observing, and it wasn't long before I saw the subtle changes in her posture. The way she clenched her jaw, the slight tension in her grip on the pen. She was watching Ray as though he was slipping away, even as she pretended I had her full attention. Just as I was about to make an excuse to leave, Ray caught Lena's eye, giving her a barely perceptible nod, which she answered with a slight, involuntary smile. I felt the bitterness rise in my chest, but this time, I forced it down, letting the moment play out. Their silent exchange was more than enough confirmation of the suspicions I'd held for weeks. Noticing my gaze, Lena quickly dropped the smile. "Let's get coffee sometime this week, Daniel," she suggested, an unexpected softness entering her voice. Just to talk about things. For the kids' sake, if nothing else." "For the kids," I echoed, not bothering to hide the sarcasm. "Is that why you're here every late night now? For the kids?" She narrowed her eyes, as if weighing her response. "There's no need for that, Daniel," she replied in a hushed tone, almost as if Ray might overhear. But before I could respond, she shot me a pointed glance, as if daring me to make a scene here, in front of her colleagues and Ray. I raised my hands in a mock surrender. "Fine, Lena. Coffee, sure. But I'd say the kids are handling things just fine, wouldn't you?" Her face tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she gestured toward the door, silently telling me that my business here was done. I nodded, feigning indifference, but as I walked past Ray and his new conversation partner, I caught a few words, enough to know he was already working on charming her. The way she laughed at something he said, her hand grazing his arm, reminded me of Lena's own reactions around him. It was the same routine, the same manipulative game. That night, I lay awake, replaying the scene in my mind. Lena was clearly invested in her affair with Ray, enough to feel possessive. Yet, as I had seen, she wasn't the only woman in his sights. The thought brought a strange sense of satisfaction. Lena had gone to him, enthralled by his wealth, his status, his attention, only to become one of many. I realized then that Ray had no real interest in her, beyond the thrill of her availability, her married status, a fact that would eventually surface and expose her foolishness. My thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of a text. I glanced at my phone, surprised to see it was from Alex. "Saw Lena with Ray again. Thought you should know. Things seem complicated. We should talk." I stared at the message for a moment, debating my response, then typed back, "Let's meet tomorrow. There's more you should know." The next morning, I met Alex at a small cafe on the waterfront. He looked worn, his usual energy dulled, as if burdened by some inner conflict. I wasted no time, deciding the truth was long overdue. "So, Lena and Ray," I began, watching his reaction. His face tightened, and he ran a hand over his face, clearly uncomfortable. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them together that night. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the one to ruin things. I thought it would pass." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "There's more, Alex. Ray isn't just seeing Lena. I saw him yesterday, already working his charm on another married woman in her office. Lena doesn't know, she's just another number in his game." The realization hit him hard, and he looked away, clenching his fists. "You're saying Ray's after married women? Just collecting them like trophies?" I nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. He goes for women like Lena, women who feel unappreciated or bored in their marriages, who want something exciting. But it never lasts. They're just temporary for him." A flicker of doubt crossed his face. "Are you sure she doesn't know?" "I think she's starting to suspect," I replied. "But she's caught up in it, chasing his approval. And it's only a matter of time before this whole thing unravels. The man's playing with fire." Alex sighed, glancing around the cafe. "My wife, Danielle, has been acting strange lately, hanging around Lena more often. I thought it was just, girls' nights out. But now I wonder." The silence that followed was tense, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It seemed Ray's twisted games had entangled more than just my marriage. I wondered how many others were caught in his web, and how long it would be before it all came crashing down. Before we left, I handed Alex the ring. "I kept my promise. Now it's yours to deliver. She'll know what it means." Alex took the ring, nodding solemnly. With every nail hammered, every wall painted, my section of the house morphed into something wholly mine. The days of shared spaces, of furniture Lena had chosen, of walls that held memories now too bitter to bear. All of it was being wiped away, replaced by something new, something unburdened. It took weeks, but when I stepped back, surveying the sleek, modern bachelor pad I'd created, I barely recognized it. Clean lines, fresh paint, state-of-the-art appliances, and finally, a home gym to replace the dining room Lena had once insisted we rarely used. It wasn't just the place itself. Each change seemed to strip away a layer of resentment, and in its place, I found a strange and surprising optimism. I looked forward to coming home each night, no longer just a shell of the man I'd felt like since Lena's betrayal. One afternoon, when the last touches had been added and the space finally felt complete, I invited Rachel over. She arrived with a bright smile, curious eyes taking in every detail as she walked through the newly furnished rooms. She stopped at the kitchen, running her fingers over the marble countertops. "Daniel, you've turned this place into a luxury suite," she said, laughing as she took in the place. "This could be straight out of a design magazine." "Well, I wanted to change," I replied, smiling. "And it's been good for me." She looked at me thoughtfully, as though seeing me anew. "You seem different. In a good way, I mean. Lighter." I nodded. "I feel different. It's strange, going through something like this. You expect it to tear you down. But I feel like I've built something new from the ashes." We sat down in the living room, and Rachel told me about the new dance classes she was leading, about her students, some of whom were almost as old as her. There was a brightness in her, an ease that made her seem a world away from the quiet tension I'd lived with in my marriage. Her laughter was infectious, and before I knew it, hours had slipped by as we talked. By the time she left, it was clear she had become a regular presence in my life. And strangely, I welcomed it. The following weekend, Sophie and Caleb came over. They hadn't seen the renovated space yet, and as they walked through, their eyes wide, I saw the excitement spark in their expressions. "Dad, this is amazing," Sophie said, inspecting the new entertainment system. "This is way better than Mom's side," she added with a mischievous grin. Caleb wandered into the gym and whistled, clearly impressed. "So, you're going to be the cool dad with the home gym and the giant TV now. Just don't tell your mom," I replied, sharing a laugh with them. "Now, go grab your stuff. We're heading out." The kids were thrilled when I took them shopping. It was something Lena and I used to do as a family, but today it was just the three of us. They picked out clothes and books, and we ended the day with a dinner at one of their favorite places. They were relaxed, laughing, their banter easy and light, with no trace of the tension that usually filled the air when Lena was around. I realized that they, too, were slowly finding a rhythm in this new version of our family. Rachel joined us near the end of dinner, bringing dessert to the table. The kids welcomed her warmly, and I could see how comfortable they were with her. Sophie and Caleb chatted with her like an old friend, and as she laughed with them, I couldn't ignore the ease in their interactions. I sensed that they were beginning to accept her as part of their world, a new fixture in the landscape that had shifted beneath our feet. As we walked back to the car, I noticed Sophie trailing behind with Rachel, whispering something to her with a grin. When Rachel met my gaze, her eyes held a question, a spark of something I hadn't seen in so long that it almost startled me. I realized then just how deeply she had begun to settle into our lives. A week later, I ran into Lena at a coffee shop near her office. I was just leaving with my cup when she spotted me, her face lighting up in what I could only describe as a look of hope. "Daniel," she called, hurrying over. "I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk." I gave her a polite nod, half listening as she made small talk. But before long, she began leaning into something I hadn't expected. "Look, I know things have been difficult," she started, her eyes turning serious. "But I've been thinking about us, about the kids, and I don't want to throw everything away, Daniel. We've had years together, years that were real. Don't you think we owe it to ourselves to try?" Her words were laced with emotion, and for a brief moment, I almost believed her. But the memory of her with Ray, the look in her eyes when she thought no one was watching, crushed any trace of hope I might have felt. Still, I kept my voice calm. "And what about Ray?" I asked, my tone even. A flicker of something, guilt perhaps, flashed across her face, but she quickly masked it. "It was a mistake," she said quietly. I was confused, but I'm here now, and I want to make things right. Do you, Lena? I asked, watching her carefully. Because I think you're only here because you're realizing you're not the only one he's interested in. Her face fell, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her confidence. She looked away, her fingers twisting nervously. What are you talking about? I saw him, Lena. I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. I saw him with another woman from your office, and he wasn't exactly subtle about it. She stared at me, her expression torn between anger and humiliation. He's not. It's different with me, she said, as though convincing herself more than me. I didn't respond. I watched as the reality of the situation dawned on her, as she began to understand that Ray's attention wasn't as exclusive as she'd imagined. It was a moment of clarity, the look in her eyes shifting from defiance to something raw and painful. But I knew better than to let her back into my life out of pity. Lena, this isn't about fixing things for the kids. You made your choices. Now, I'm making mine. Without waiting for her response, I left. As I walked away, I felt an odd satisfaction, a sense of finality that hadn't been there before. That evening, I met Rachel for drinks at a rooftop bar overlooking the Seattle skyline. The view was breathtaking, the lights stretching out into the horizon, and for the first time, I felt at peace looking out over the city. Rachel joined me, her eyes bright as she took in the view. You look like a man who's just won a hard battle, she said, smiling. Something like that, I replied, feeling a sense of accomplishment settle in my chest. It feels like a new chapter. She raised her glass, grinning. Then here's to new chapters, and maybe some stories that end better than we expect. We laughed, but as the evening wore on, she grew serious, lowering her voice. I don't know if you're ready to hear this, Daniel, but Ray has a reputation. He's left more than a few women heartbroken. He likes the thrill, the attention, but it never ends well. I stared at her, taken aback. How do you know about Ray? She hesitated, then looked at me with a seriousness that made me shiver. Let's just say his name has come up more than once among people I know. Married women, mostly. And usually, it ends with anger, sometimes even revenge. Her words lingered, echoing in the back of my mind as I took it in. I thought of Lena, of all the others Ray had likely left in his wake, each of them trying to pick up the pieces of their lives while he moved on without a second thought. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, a sleek black envelope edged with silver, inviting me to an exclusive event at one of Seattle's most upscale clubs. It was the kind of place where the wealthy and powerful gathered to flaunt their success, where business deals were closed over whiskey and secrets were exchanged like currency. I hadn't planned on attending, but something told me this night would reveal more than just the usual cocktails and polished smiles. As I stepped into the club, a low hum of conversation and the clink of crystal glasses filled the air. Chandeliers cast soft, opulent light over the crowd, illuminating faces I recognized from around the city. But it wasn't just the usual crowd tonight. Scattered among the regulars were men I knew, fathers, husbands, friends of friends. Men who, like me, had lost something to Ray's charm, each with his own silent resentment hidden beneath a forced smile. It didn't take long to spot Ray. He was surrounded by a small crowd, exuding his usual arrogance, dressed in a suit that seemed to draw the attention of every woman in the room. Lena was nowhere to be seen, but my eyes fell on Alex, standing near the bar, his expression tense as he watched Ray. He caught my gaze and gestured for me to join him, an unspoken, understanding passing between us. Didn't expect to see you here, Alex said, raising his glass slightly as I approached. Didn't plan on coming, I replied, my voice low. But something told me tonight might be interesting. He smirked, a bitter edge to his smile. You're not the only one. Ray's arrogance has crossed too many lines. As he spoke, two other men sidled up, faces familiar from other gatherings, and from whispered conversations around town. Each of them shared a look, the same unspoken anger simmering just beneath the surface. One of them, Tom, leaned in. You know, Ray's been seen with almost half the women in this room, he muttered, barely hiding his disgust. My wife isn't one of them, but I'm here because I've seen what he's done to my friends' marriages. He's a wrecking ball, and he acts like he's untouchable. Another man, Mark, a quiet, reserved type I'd known only by reputation, nodded. Same story, different day. He hits on anything in a ring. I used to think it was just rumors, but it's worse. He takes it as some twisted game, like he's daring us to do something. I clench my jaw, feeling the heat rise in my chest. I glanced over at Ray, watching as he smoothly navigated his conversations, throwing charming smiles and winks, oblivious to the tension pooling around him. Maybe tonight, he'll finally get what he deserves, I murmured, the words escaping before I'd fully thought them through. Alex shot me a sidelong glance, his expression unreadable, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he took a long sip from his glass, eyes fixed on Ray with an intensity one hadn't seen in him before. We all exchanged looks, and for the first time, I realized just how much resentment had built up, how many people in this room were silently plotting some form of revenge. A few more men joined us, each with his own story of betrayal or near betrayal, each harboring his own quiet anger. As the night wore on, Ray seemed to become aware of the collective stares. He shifted uneasily, his smiles a touch more forced, his laughter a shade too loud. He knew he was surrounded by people who despised him, yet his ego kept him rooted to the spot, as if he believed himself invulnerable. The tension grew thicker, an electric charge in the air, and I could feel something shift. It was in the way the men stood, a subtle shift in posture, as though each of us was prepared to act, should the opportunity arise. Ray, sensing the atmosphere, slipped out a side door with a woman on his arm, laughing as though he'd escaped the scrutiny, oblivious to the simmering fury he left behind. Later that night, I was heading out when I saw the commotion. It wasn't subtle. The unmistakable sound of raised voices and scuffling feet coming from an alleyway beside the club. Instinctively, I slowed my pace, moving toward the sound. I caught a glimpse of Ray, his suit rumpled, struggling against two shadowy figures. A taser crackled, a flash of electric light illuminating his face, twisted in shock and pain. A fist connected with his jaw, and he staggered back, eyes wide with terror. He barely had time to react before his assailant landed a swift, brutal kick to his knee, followed by a sickening crack as Ray's leg buckled beneath him. "Please," he shouted, desperation clawing into his voice, his usual arrogance shattered. One of the men leaned in close, his face obscured, and murmured something I couldn't hear. Ray's expression contorted in fear as he glanced around wildly, as though trying to see if anyone was watching. But the alley was cloaked in darkness, hiding his attackers as they delivered a final blow to his other knee, leaving him gasping on the pavement. I stepped back, my heart racing, caught between shock and a strange satisfaction. They were gone as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving Ray sprawled on the ground, clutching his shattered legs, his cries echoing through the alley. I knew no one would come. In this part of town, people had a way of ignoring anything that seemed inconvenient. For a brief moment, I felt the urge to step forward, to let him see me, to let him know that the men who had done this weren't alone in their anger. But I stayed hidden, my face impassive as I watched him struggle, the harsh reality of his situation finally dawning on him. Ray had destroyed so many lives, and tonight he'd finally been forced to reckon with his own. The following day, news of the attack spread like wildfire through the city's circles. Rumors swirled, each more dramatic than the last, and though no one dared to say it outright, everyone whispered the same theory: angry husbands. There was no official investigation, no police report. Ray himself remained silent, unwilling to admit he'd been brought down by the very people he'd taken for granted. But his absence was noted, and the whispers grew louder. I learned through Alex that Ray was in no shape to show up at his office, that he'd suffered severe damage to both knees, which left him in constant pain and unable to walk without crutches. Word spread quickly that he would soon be stepping down as CEO, his high-profile life reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. The rumors painted a vivid picture of Ray, the once unassailable charmer, now trapped in a prison of his own arrogance, his movements limited, his status diminished. I didn't feel pity, only a sense of justice, a feeling that the balance had finally shifted. Men like Ray believed they were invincible, that their actions had no consequences. But they had, in the end, just as we had all suspected they would. That evening, I met Alex again, this time at a quieter bar. We didn't discuss Ray directly. There was no need. Instead, we sat in a comfortable silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually, Alex spoke. "Justice has a way of finding people like him," he said softly, lifting his glass. "Sometimes it just needs a little push." I nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of closure, as though I had finally stepped out of the shadow that had loomed over my life. "Here's to moving on," I said, clinking my glass against his. And as we drank, I knew that whatever the future held, it would be mine to shape. Sunlight streamed into my home, casting a warm glow over the polished surfaces and clean lines I'd spent months perfecting. My side of the house felt truly mine, a sanctuary I'd built from the remnants of my old life, filling it with new memories, new possibilities. And as I sat at the kitchen table that morning, sipping my coffee, I felt an unexpected peace settle over me. The sound of the doorbell broke my thoughts, and as I rose to answer it, a sense of foreboding washed over me. I didn't need to check. I already knew who it would be. I opened the door to find Lena standing there, looking worn, her makeup barely covering the shadows beneath her eyes. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft. I thought maybe we could talk." I let out a slow breath, bracing myself. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside to let her pass. Lena glanced around the renovated space, her eyes scanning the new furniture, the vibrant artwork, the modern touches that were worlds apart from the life we'd once shared. It was as if she could see the distance between us in every detail. "I hardly recognize this place," she murmured, almost to herself. "That was the idea," I replied simply, watching her take it all in. She turned back to me, her expression a mixture of longing and regret. "Daniel, I know things got out of hand. I made mistakes, but I want to fix things. For the kids, for us." She looked down, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. "Maybe we can try again." I met her gaze, feeling a strange calmness settle over me. "Lena, you're only here because Ray is gone. You want to come back now that you've lost everything you thought you had with him." She shook her head, her expression one of denial. "No, it's not like that. I love you, Daniel. I want to rebuild what we had. We owe it to each other." I sighed, feeling more exhausted than angry. "No, Lena. Whatever we had, it's gone. I spent too long trying to make things right between us, and I gave you every chance. But it's too late." I watched her face fall, a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "Please, Daniel. I know I hurt you, but we were partners once. We can be that again." "Lena," I said firmly, "I've moved on. I've started something new with Rachel, and she's brought something into my life I didn't even realize I was missing." She stared at me, her expression wavering between shock and disbelief. "Rachel? You're serious?" "Yes. She's been there for me in ways you never were," I replied, the finality in my voice clear. "And I don't want to go back to who I was with you. I've found someone who actually sees me, respects me." Lena's gaze dropped, and for a moment, she looked as though she might argue. But instead, she nodded, a bitter smile on her face. "I suppose I always underestimated you," she said quietly. I thought I'd always have you waiting, no matter what." I didn't respond, and after a moment, she looked away, her shoulders slumping. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She simply turned and walked out, letting the door fall closed behind her. I stayed there, feeling the air settle around me, the final remnants of our past slipping away. Later that day, as I picked up Sophie and Caleb for a weekend trip I'd planned, I could feel their excitement bubbling over. They climbed into the car, bombarding me with questions about the lakeside resort where we were headed, and the energy was infectious. "Is Rachel coming with us?" Sophie asked, glancing at me with a mischievous grin. "She is," I replied, unable to hold back a smile. "I thought you two could use the extra company." They both cheered, and we set off, the road stretching out ahead as the city fell away behind us. By the time we arrived, Rachel was already there, waiting in the lobby with her bags, her smile warm and easy as she hugged each of the kids. "Long drive?" she asked, giving me a quick smile as she reached for my hand. The simple gesture felt grounding, a reminder of everything we'd built since that first, hesitant conversation at the club. The resort was perfect, set on the shore of a clear blue lake, with tall pines surrounding us, casting cool shadows in the summer sun. We spent the day swimming, exploring nearby trails, and even taking out a small rowboat that Caleb insisted on captaining. The kids took to Rachel with an openness I hadn't expected, laughing and chatting with her as if they'd known her for years. And Rachel, with her natural warmth and humor, seemed to fit seamlessly into the small world we'd created. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Rachel and I sat on the dock, watching the stars ripple on the lake's surface. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind that needed no words. She leaned against my shoulder, her hand resting on mine, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know, I didn't think this kind of peace was possible," she murmured, glancing up at me with a soft smile. I nodded, feeling the same sense of contentment. "Neither did I. But here we are." She squeezed my hand, and for a moment, I considered everything that had led me here. All the betrayal, the broken trust, the struggle to rebuild myself. Yet, as I sat there with Rachel beside me, the bitterness that had once consumed me felt like a distant memory. "Where do you see us going from here?" she asked, her tone light, though I could feel the weight of the question. I thought about it for a moment, searching for the right words. "I see us building something new, together. I don't want to rush anything, but I also know that I gesture between us, this feels right." Her smile widened, a quiet understanding passing between us. "Then let's take it one day at a time," she said, resting her head on my shoulder again. In the days that followed, we fell into an easy rhythm, each day a reminder of the life I had now, free from the shadows of the past. And as I watched Rachel with Sophie and Caleb, their laughter echoing across the lake, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of gratitude. When we returned home, I heard through the grapevine that Lena's real estate firm had suffered a blow, her professional reputation tainted as whispers of Ray's affairs became public. Clients withdrew, concerned about the scandal, and Lena found herself losing ground in a career she'd once dominated. The knowledge settled over me like a strange form of justice, a final twist in the web of betrayal she'd woven. But I didn't dwell on it. I had no interest in seeing Lena suffer. I'd left that part of my life behind. All that mattered was here, the fresh start I'd carved out of chaos, the family I'd kept, and the new love I'd found. As I watched Rachel laughing with the kids over an impromptu dinner back home, I realized that for the first time in years, I had reclaimed my life. The betrayal, the pain, it had all brought me here, to this moment of quiet victory, this beginning I never would have imagined. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.